In the summer of 1903, the heat in Panama did not merely press down on the body. It crawled into the lungs, soaked into the bones, and lingered there like a living thing. Men who arrived confident and upright often found themselves hunched within weeks, their optimism dissolved by sweat, disease, and a jungle that seemed to resent human ambition. John Frank Stevens stood on a muddy embankment near the Culebra Cut and stared at what remained of the French dream. Rusting machines lay half swallowed by vines. Iron rails vanished into tall grass. Abandoned locomotives sat like carcasses, their boilers split open by years of neglect. This was supposed to have been the place where Europe conquered nature. Instead, it had become a graveyard of arrogance. Stevens removed his hat and wiped his forehead. He was not a man given to romance, and what he saw did not inspire poetry. It inspired calculation. Behind him, an American flag flapped awkwardly in the wet air. Only months earlier, this land had belonged to Colombia. Now it was the Republic of Panama, newly born, diplomatically fragile, and already tied by treaty to the most ambitious engineering project the United States had ever attempted. A canal here would change the world, or destroy the men who tried to build it. Stevens had been summoned by President Theodore Roosevelt himself, a man who believed history was shaped by those bold enough to grab it by the throat. Roosevelt wanted a canal that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, cut thousands of miles off naval and commercial routes, and announce, without apology, that the United States had arrived as a global power. But Roosevelt did not have to live in Panama. Stevens did. And Stevens understood something Roosevelt in Washington could not fully grasp. Before moving a single cubic yard of earth, they would have to defeat death itself. Yellow fever and malaria ruled the isthmus more effectively than any government. Hospitals were full of men shaking uncontrollably, eyes sunken, skin yellowed. Coffins were stacked so frequently that burials became routine rather than solemn. The French had learned this lesson too late. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the celebrated builder of the Suez Canal, had arrived in Panama in the 1880s, convinced that genius alone could bend geography to his will. He had ignored warnings, dismissed engineers who disagreed with him, and attempted to carve a sea-level canal straight through the continental divide. The jungle responded mercilessly. Over 20,000 workers died under French management. Landslides erased months of labor overnight. Mosquitoes, unseen and underestimated, killed more efficiently than any machine failure. By 1889, the company collapsed in scandal, bankruptcy, and shame. Now, America stood where France had fallen. Stevens walked along the Clet, boots sinking into mud, and felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He knew that if the United States repeated the French mistakes, the canal would become not a monument to progress, but a warning etched into the earth. That night, in his quarters, Stevens wrote a letter to Washington that would quietly reshape the entire project. He did not talk about glory. He did not talk about speed. He talked about sanitation. He demanded screened windows, paved streets, proper sewage, clean water, and a war not on mountains, but on mosquitoes. Many in Washington scoffed. Engineers wanted steam shovels, not doctors. Politicians wanted results, not expenses on public health. But Stevens refused to proceed. And for the first time in the long, violent history of empire and engineering, human survival became the first priority. Entered Dr. William C. Gorgas. Gorgas was an unlikely hero, soft-spoken, methodical, and obsessed with insects most men swatted without thought. He believed, based on recent scientific breakthroughs, that mosquitoes carried yellow fever and malaria. Not bad air, not miasma, mosquitoes. In Panama, this idea sounded absurd to many. Gorgas ordered standing water drained. He fumigated buildings. He spread oil over puddles to suffocate larvae. He insisted on mosquito nets and window screens, even for senior officials. Men laughed. Then the death rate dropped. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. By 1906, yellow fever had been virtually eliminated from the canal zone. Malaria cases plummeted. For the first time in centuries, the isthmus became survivable for large populations of foreign workers. The jungle had not been conquered, but it had been negotiated with. Only then did the real battle begin. Stevens abandoned the idea of a sea-level canal. Instead, he proposed something radical, a system of massive locks that would lift ships up into an artificial lake carved from the jungle, then lower them back to sea level on the other side. It was a gamble. The locks would be the largest concrete structures ever built. No one had attempted anything like this before. If they failed, ships could be crushed, sunk, or stranded halfway between oceans. Roosevelt approved it without hesitation. "Make the dirt fly," he said. And it did. Steam shovels roared day and night, chewing through rock that had resisted centuries of ambition. Trains hauled away millions of tons of earth. Entire hills disappeared. Rivers were redirected. The Chagres River, unpredictable and violent, was tamed by the construction of the Gatun Dam, creating what was then the largest artificial lake in the world. Workers came from the Caribbean, Europe, Asia, and the American South. They lived in segregated camps, paid on unequal scales, and subjected to rigid discipline. The canal was a marvel, but it was also built on inequality. Accidents were frequent. Landslides buried men without warning. Explosions misfired. Machinery failed catastrophically. The earth itself seemed to resist, sliding back into the cut as if trying to heal the wound carved into it. Then, in 1906, Theodore Roosevelt did something no sitting American president had ever done before. He came to Panama. Photographs captured him standing atop a massive steam shovel, smiling broadly, sleeves rolled up. The image was carefully staged, but the impact was real. The President of the United States had placed himself physically at the site of American ambition. Behind the smile, however, Roosevelt saw the cost. He saw exhausted workers. He saw coffins. He saw a project that could still fail spectacularly if momentum faltered. By the time the canal officially opened in August 1914, Europe was already at war. The first ship to transit the canal passed almost quietly, without grand international celebration. Headlines were dominated by the outbreak of World War I. Yet the canal would soon prove its strategic value beyond anything Roosevelt had imagined. American naval power could shift oceans in weeks instead of months. Global trade routes reoriented themselves around this narrow passage of water. Nations recalculated their strategies. Geography itself had been rewritten. But the canal's story did not end in triumph. For decades, Panama lived under the shadow of American control. The canal zone became a symbol of foreign dominance on Panamanian soil. Protests erupted, blood was spilled, resentment simmered. It would take nearly a century and intense political struggle before control of the canal was fully transferred to Panama in 1999. By then, the canal had moved over 1 million ships. Each one carried not just cargo, but echoes of ambition, sacrifice, disease, power, and resistance. The canal was not merely dug. It was paid for in lives, reshaped by science, justified by empire, and ultimately reclaimed by the people whose land had been cut in two. And the jungle still watches.
The jungle never forgot what had been taken from it.
Even after the last American engineers packed their papers and the final ceremonial speeches faded into history, the rainforest pressed in close to the canal's edges, vines creeping toward concrete, humidity gnawing at steel. The canal existed not because nature had surrendered, but because it had been forced into an uneasy truce. In the years immediately following the opening of the canal, the United States Navy began to understand what it truly possessed. Battleships that once had to round Cape Horn, battered by storms, delayed for months, could now redeploy between oceans in a matter of days. War planners redrew maps, trade routes realigned, ports rose and fell based on their proximity to this artificial artery. But for the people of Panama, the canal was a paradox. It brought jobs, infrastructure, and global relevance. It also brought fences, foreign laws, and a line, both physical and symbolic, that cut their nation in two. The Canal Zone was governed as if it were American soil. American flags flew over schools, post offices, and police stations. Panamanians who crossed into the zone were subject to American authority. Wages were divided by race and nationality, a system known bitterly as gold roll and silver roll. White American workers were paid in gold-backed currency. Black Caribbean laborers and local Panamanians were paid less in silver. Resentment did not explode all at once. It accumulated. Children grew up seeing land their parents could not freely enter. Workers cleaned streets they did not own. A generation learned, quietly and steadily, that the canal was both the heart of their country and something they were told did not belong to them. In Washington, few noticed. The canal had become background infrastructure, so reliable that its existence felt inevitable. Politicians spoke of it only when tolls were adjusted or when ships transited faster than expected. The extraordinary had become ordinary, until the world fractured again. When World War II erupted, the canal became one of the most strategically sensitive locations on Earth. American military planners feared sabotage, aerial attack, or infiltration. Anti-aircraft guns appeared along the hills. Barracks filled with soldiers who had never heard of Panama before being sent there to protect it. German U-boats prowled the Caribbean. Japanese expansion in the Pacific raised new alarms. If the canal were disabled, even temporarily, the balance of naval power could shift dramatically. It was during these years that the canal revealed another truth. Technology had changed, but vulnerability had not disappeared. One well-placed bomb could undo decades of engineering. The war passed without a successful attack on the canal, but the lesson lingered. Control of the canal meant influence far beyond Panama's borders, and influence, once tasted, was rarely relinquished voluntarily. After the war, the world moved into a new kind of conflict. The Cold War did not announce itself with declarations. It crept in through ideology, suspicion, and proxy struggles. Latin America became a chessboard for superpower anxieties, and Panama, because of the canal, a square of particular importance. Panamanian nationalism intensified. Students marched, workers organized, politicians began to speak more openly about sovereignty. They did not demand the canal's destruction, they demanded dignity. In January 1964, that tension ignited. A dispute over the flying of flags, American and Panamanian, escalated into riots. Shots were fired, buildings burned. 21 Panamanians were killed. The incident shocked the nation and reverberated internationally. For many Americans, it was the first time Panama entered the news not as a marvel of engineering, but as a place of anger and bloodshed. Negotiations followed, slowly and reluctantly. Treaties were drafted, rejected, revised, and delayed. Each side accused the other of bad faith. Years passed. It was not until the late 1970s that history finally shifted. President Jimmy Carter, guided by a belief that American power should be tempered by fairness, entered into negotiations with Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos. Torrijos was charismatic, nationalistic, and deeply aware of the canal's symbolic power. He framed the struggle not as anti-American, but as anti-colonial. The resulting treaties were controversial in the United States. Critics warned of lost influence, weakened security, and national humiliation. Supporters argued that legitimacy, once eroded, could not be enforced forever. In 1977, the Torrijos-Carter treaties were signed. They set in motion a gradual transfer of control, culminating on December 31, 1999, when Panama would assume full authority over the canal. For Torrijos, it was a vindication he would not live to see. He died in a mysterious plane crash in 1981, fueling decades of speculation. For Carter, it was one of the proudest and most politically costly decisions of his presidency. When the final handover came, there were no riots. There was relief. Panama inherited not just a canal, but a responsibility. The waterway had to be maintained, modernized, and defended in a world vastly different from the one that had existed in 1914. And Panama rose to the challenge. Under Panamanian management, efficiency increased, revenues grew, expansion projects were launched to accommodate massive container ships that early engineers could never have imagined. New locks were built, larger, more sophisticated, guided by satellites rather than hand signals. The canal evolved. Yet every ship that passes through still follows a path carved by men who died long before GPS, antibiotics, or global media. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their labor remains embedded in the rock, the concrete, the water itself. The canal is often described as a shortcut. In truth, it is a compression of history, a narrow corridor through which ambition, science, exploitation, diplomacy, and resilience have all flowed. And every time the gates close and the water rises, lifting a vessel between oceans, the past rises with it, silent, heavy, and impossible to erase. By the early 21st century, the Panama Canal no longer belonged to empire or ideology. It belonged to time. Ships entering from the Atlantic waited their turn like pilgrims approaching a shrine, engines idling, crews leaning on rails, watching green hills rise in the distance. To the casual observer, the process looked almost serene. Few could sense the layered past beneath the waterline, the bones of ambition, the arithmetic of power, the quiet violence of progress. Yet history has a way of resurfacing. In 2016, Panama completed the largest expansion in the canal's history. New locks, wider, deeper, longer, welcomed ships so massive they were once considered impossible to route through the isthmus. These Neo-Panamax vessels carried over 14,000 containers each, floating cities of steel and commerce. Global trade adjusted again. American ports raced to deepen harbors. Railroads expanded inland. The economics of shipping reshaped supply chains from Asia to the American Midwest. A decision made in a Central American country rippled outward, affecting grocery prices in Kansas and factory schedules in Ohio. The canal had always been about more than Panama. For the United States, it remained a mirror, reflecting how power was gained, exercised, and eventually negotiated. The canal had been born of American confidence at the dawn of the 20th century. Its transfer marked a rare moment when a superpower acknowledged that permanence was an illusion. But history is never static. Climate change began to test the canal in ways its builders never anticipated. Rainfall patterns shifted. Gatun Lake, the canal's freshwater lifeline, dropped to dangerously low levels during drought years. Each ship transit consumed millions of gallons of fresh water released into the sea. Suddenly, the canal faced a new enemy. Not disease, not landslides, not war. Scarcity. Engineers and policymakers scrambled for solutions: water-saving basins, revised transit schedules, long-term watershed protection. The same canal that once symbolized mastery over nature now depended on careful cooperation with it. The irony was not lost on historians. The jungle that had been beaten back with fire, steel, and concrete was now essential to the canal's survival. Forests preserved rainfall, rivers regulated flow, sustainability replaced domination as the guiding philosophy. The canal endured because it adapted, and adaptation, more than strength, had always been its true story. Long before Roosevelt's bravado, before Stevens' calculations, before Gorgas's mosquito nets, indigenous peoples had crossed this land using paths and rivers, trading between oceans without ever trying to fuse them. They moved with geography, not against it. The canal ignored those lessons, then slowly learned them. Every historical miracle carries this duality. It astonishes because it succeeds, and it endures because it changes. The Panama Canal is astonishing not because it exists, but because it continues to matter in a world that has transformed repeatedly since the first shovel broke ground. From imperial ambition to national sovereignty, from steam power to satellite navigation, from unchecked conquest to environmental restraint, the canal absorbed each era without losing its purpose. And perhaps that is the most surprising truth of all. Not that humans carved a passage between two oceans, but that over time they learned to listen to the land they cut through. Long before steel gates rose and water was commanded to climb uphill, the isthmus had already decided its role in history. For thousands of years, this narrow strip of land had been a hinge between worlds. Long before Europeans arrived with maps and cannons, indigenous traders moved jade, gold, feathers, and stories from one ocean to the other. They did not carve the earth, they listened to it, following rivers when they swelled, retreating when rains turned paths into mud. Then came the Spaniards. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa stood knee-deep in the Pacific, claiming an ocean for a crown that barely understood the land beneath its boots. Spain quickly grasped what Panama represented: speed. Treasure from Peru crossed the isthmus on mule trails, passed from river to sea, then sailed onward to Europe. The land bled gold and lives. That was the first canal. It was built of human bodies. Indigenous populations collapsed under disease and forced labor. African slaves replaced them. The isthmus became a conveyor belt of wealth flowing outward, never inward. The pattern was set early. Panama mattered because others needed to pass through it. Centuries later, the pattern repeated with different flags. When the California gold rush erupted in 1448, Americans rediscovered Panama's value almost overnight. Thousands crossed the isthmus to reach the Pacific faster. Hotels, railways, and ports sprang up. The Panama Railroad, completed in 1855, was itself an engineering marvel, built at staggering human cost. Workers died by the thousands: cholera, malaria, heat, violence. Yet trains ran, and once again, efficiency mattered more than the men who delivered it. This was the historical current the canal entered, a current older than the United States, older than modern engineering. The canal did not create Panama's destiny, it intensified it. For Americans, the canal fit neatly into a national myth: progress through ingenuity, obstacles conquered by will. For Panamanians, the canal was another chapter in a long story of others deciding the future of their land. Both interpretations were true. The United States genuinely advanced global commerce and navigation. Lives were saved by shorter voyages, economies grew, the world became smaller. But power rarely travels without consequence. The canal became a lens through which Americans could examine their own contradictions, champions of self-determination who controlled foreign territory, advocates of democracy who enforced segregation, builders of miracles who relied on invisible labor. These contradictions did not explode immediately, they waited. By the late 20th century, American foreign policy faced growing skepticism worldwide. Vietnam, Watergate, covert interventions, all chipped away at the assumption that American leadership was inherently benevolent. Letting go of the canal was not weakness, it was recognition, and recognition reshapes legacy. Today, most Americans encounter the Panama Canal only as a line on a map or a trivia question. Few know the names Stevens or Gorgas. Fewer still think about the Caribbean workers buried without markers, or the Panamanian students killed demanding a flag. Yet every product that arrives faster, every ship that avoids a treacherous route, every naval deployment that pivots smoothly between oceans, each is touched by their lives. History does not demand remembrance, it persists regardless. The canal continues to function not because the past was perfect, but because the future kept revising it. Each generation reinterpreted what the canal meant and adjusted how it was used, governed, and justified. That is why it survives, not as a monument frozen in time, but as a living system, political, environmental, and human. And somewhere in the humid air above the locks, where the sound of water filling chambers echoes against concrete, the jungle still waits, not to reclaim everything, just to remind the world that nothing built by human hands is ever truly permanent.